Message collapsed. She pointed at him like he was something she'd found stuck to the bottom of her heel. You... Celeste Ashford's voice cut across the grand ballroom, sharp enough to silence 3 separate conversations. Did you just spill on my guests? The waiter, mid-30s, tired eyes, a small wine stain spreading across the white tablecloth, stood very still. He didn't cringe, didn't apologize 5 times in a row, just looked at her with this quiet that seemed to irritate her more than any argument could. Fire him, she said to no one and everyone, tonight, and someone find out how a man like this even got hired. If that moment just made your blood pressure tick up a little, good. That means you're paying attention. Hit that subscribe button right now because the story we're about to tell you does not slow down from here. Drop a comment and tell us what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this one travels. Like the video so more people find it, and then stay with us. Because in about 4 minutes, everything Celeste Ashford thought she knew about power is going to get turned completely upside down. The Harrington Grand was the kind of hotel that made people feel important just by walking through the front doors. 40-foot ceilings, marble floors the color of old cream, chandeliers imported from a glassblower in Venice who had since retired, which the hotel's promotional materials mentioned with the particular pride of people who understand that scarcity is its own form of status. On the night of the Ashford Meridian Annual Shareholder Gala, the Grand's main ballroom had been rented out completely, every table, every chair, every corner of the room, and the guest list read like a directory of the kind of wealth that doesn't need to announce itself, because it's been around long enough that everyone already knows. Damien Cross had been working the event since 4:30 in the afternoon. He'd been on his feet for 6 hours by the time the formal dinner service began, and his lower back had been quietly complaining since hour 3. He was 37 years old, and he was a waiter. Not a waiter who was also writing a screenplay, not a waiter between careers, not a waiter with a plan he was about to execute. Just a waiter. That was the story he'd let people tell about him, and he'd stopped correcting it years ago because correcting it would have required explaining things he wasn't ready to explain. He had a daughter named Maya, who was 9, and who had recently become obsessed with marine biology after watching a documentary about the deep ocean. She kept a notebook full of drawings of anglerfish, which was either a sign of tremendous creativity or something her school counselor might want to know about. Damien wasn't sure which. She was with his neighbor, Mrs. Okafor tonight, a retired school teacher who watched Maya twice a week and refused to take more than $20 per visit, which Damien supplemented anyway by fixing things around her apartment whenever they broke. He was carrying a tray of wine glasses when it happened. Not a full collapse. Nothing so dramatic. One of the other servers, a kid named Tyler, who was new and nervous and had been stressed all night, caught the edge of Damien's tray with his elbow while pivoting too quickly around a table. It was the kind of micro-collision that happens at catered events approximately 50 times per night and is usually resolved with a quiet exchange of apologies and a new linen. 2 glasses tipped, 1 fell. Wine spread across the tablecloth in a dark red arc. Nobody was hit. Nobody's dress was ruined. The glass didn't shatter. It bounced once on the thick carpet and came to rest near the leg of a chair, still intact. Damien crouched immediately to retrieve it. That was when Celeste Ashford turned around. She was at the head of a cluster of people. Investors Damien had gathered from overheard conversation, some from overseas, a few domestic. She was in her mid-50s, impeccably assembled in a way that looked effortless only because the effort had been made somewhere else, earlier, by people paid to make it look that way. She had the posture of someone who had been told for decades that rooms reorganized themselves around her entrance, and the bearing of someone who had come to believe it. She looked at the wine-stained tablecloth. Then she looked at Damien, still crouching, glass in hand. "You..." The word came out like a blade being drawn. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The particular frequency of her tone was the kind that cut through ambient noise, not through volume, but through authority, through the absolute certainty that when she spoke, the surrounding world would have the good sense to go quiet and listen. "Did you just spill on my guests?" "No one was hit, ma'am." Damien stood. His voice was level. Not apologetic, not defiant, just a statement of fact delivered without performance. "I'm sorry for the disruption. We'll have the linen replaced immediately." Celeste stared at him. It was the calmness that did it, probably. She was accustomed to people who stumbled over themselves in her presence, who apologized in paragraphs, who made the experience of being corrected by Celeste Ashford into an extended act of self-abasement because it was easier and safer than standing still. Damien didn't do any of that. He just stood there with the wine glass in his hand and waited for the conversation to be over. "What's your name?" she asked. He told her. Something shifted in her expression, almost nothing, the smallest tightening around the eyes. And then it passed. She turned to the event coordinator, a woman named Sandra, who had been trying to make herself invisible against the far wall for the last 30 seconds. "Get him off the floor," Celeste said. "Tonight. I don't want him in this room." Sandra opened her mouth. "I said tonight, Sandra." There were perhaps 40 people within earshot. Most of them found something to look at that wasn't Damien Cross. A few of the investors from overseas watched with the mild, detached interest of people observing a social custom they didn't fully understand. One of them, a younger man in a charcoal suit who had been introduced to Damien earlier as Mr. Leung, though Damien hadn't caught his first name, watched the whole thing with an expression that was difficult to read. Celeste had already turned back to her guests, re-engaging with the smooth pivot of someone for whom public humiliation of service staff was not an event, but a weather condition, something that happened and then was behind you. Damien put the glass back on his tray. Tyler appeared at his elbow, pale. "Damien, I'm so sorry. Don't worry about it." He meant it. He handed the tray off to a nearby server, excused himself from the floor, and walked toward the service corridor at the back of the room. He wasn't fired yet. Sandra hadn't formally said the words. But they both knew what the conversation in the corridor was going to sound like, and Damien didn't feel like making her say it in front of everyone. He'd give her the privacy of the back hallway. He was almost to the corridor door when he heard the commotion. Not yelling, this crowd didn't yell. But there was a rapid movement near the room's main entrance, a cluster of heads turning, and then a low, rolling murmur that moved through the ballroom the way a wave moves through water. Damien paused. He recognized the sound. He'd heard it in other rooms, in other contexts, in a previous life. It was the sound of a room receiving news that hadn't been scheduled. The company's legal counsel, a man named Hargrove, silver-haired, who had the particular tension in his shoulders of someone carrying information they did not want to be carrying, made his way through the room with the focused, head-down stride of a man walking towards something he'd rather be walking away from. He reached Celeste. Damien watched from across the room. He couldn't hear the words from this distance, but he watched Hargrove lean in, watched him speak, watched Celeste's face do something it almost certainly hadn't done in front of investors in a very long time. She went still. Not the controlled stillness she'd deployed on Damien earlier. Something different. The stillness of a person standing at the edge of a drop they didn't see coming. Her eyes moved across the room with the automatic, searching quality of a mind processing something unwelcome. They landed on Damien. He was already looking at her. He didn't smile. He didn't do anything that could be read as theatrical. He just held her gaze for a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, and then he turned and walked through the corridor door. 3 hours later, he was sitting in the parking structure 2 blocks from the hotel in a 10-year-old Honda Civic that needed new brakes, eating a gas station sandwich he'd bought on the way out because he hadn't had time for dinner, and his daughter's leftover pasta was still in the refrigerator at home. His phone was on the dashboard. It had been ringing for 40 minutes. He'd answered twice. Once to a number he recognized, Arthur Vance, his fund's legal coordinator, who told him what he already knew, that Hargrove had been informed, that the documentation had been filed that afternoon, that the formal transfer of debt ownership was now on public record. Once to a number he didn't recognize, which turned out to be a journalist who had somehow already gotten wind of something, though they were still speculating. The rest he let go to voicemail. He ate the sandwich. It was a turkey sandwich on white bread, slightly dry, and it was fine. He thought about Maya and whether she'd be asleep by the time he got home, and he thought it was likely she would be, and he felt the familiar minor grief of a parent who works evenings and arrives home to a quiet house and a kid already dreaming about anglerfish. His name, Damien Cross, was not what Celeste Ashford had registered when she'd looked at him tonight. He understood that. He'd been counting on it. He'd been a different kind of man 7 years ago. Not better, exactly. More visible. He'd had a corner office on the 14th floor of a financial services firm called Callaway and Reed, a firm that no longer existed under that name, having been absorbed into something larger in the years since. He'd worn better suits. He'd had a wife, Claire, who had since remarried and was living in Portland with a landscape architect named Brian, and who was a perfectly decent person who had made the reasonable decision that she didn't want to watch her husband dismantle his own life in real time while refusing to tell her why. He didn't blame her for that. He'd been difficult company in those years. He'd been the kind of financial analyst who was good enough that people occasionally forgot he was an analyst and started treating him like an oracle, which was a flattering trap. Because when you become the person in the room that everyone defers to, you also become the person in the room who's responsible when you're right. And the person in the room they need to discredit when they don't want to hear it. He'd built his reputation on being right about things people didn't want to hear. He had been right about Ashford Meridian. Celeste Ashford had built her hotel empire the way some people build houses of cards. Not with no skill, not carelessly, but with a particular variety of confident aggression that doesn't leave room for the question of what happens when the wind changes. She was brilliant in many ways. He'd never disputed that. She had an instinct for brand, for positioning, for the kind of aspirational luxury that made wealthy people feel they were buying access to something exclusive. She'd taken a regional hotel chain her father had left her and turned it into an international brand with 47 properties on 4 continents. But she'd expanded too fast and borrowed too recklessly, and the debt structure she'd built to finance that expansion was the financial equivalent of a bridge held up by the assumption that no one would ever need to cross it during a storm. In 2017, Damien had been hired by Callaway and Reed to conduct an independent assessment of Ashford Meridian's financial health ahead of a proposed bond offering. He'd done what he always did, followed the numbers wherever they led, documented what he found, wrote the report that the numbers demanded he write. The report was 48 pages. It detailed over-leveraged asset positions, deferred maintenance liabilities that had been quietly buried in subsidiary accounts, a revenue projection model for 3 key European properties that Damien's analysis suggested was optimistic by somewhere between 30 and 40%, and a debt refinancing timeline that would require market conditions to remain favorable for an unlikely consecutive stretch of years. The conclusion was not that Ashford Meridian was failing. The conclusion was that Ashford Meridian was fragile in ways that its leadership either hadn't noticed or had noticed and chosen not to document honestly. He'd submitted the report on a Friday. By Monday morning, Celeste Ashford had called the senior partners at Callaway and Reed. He never heard the exact content of that conversation. He'd been excluded from it, but the sequence of events that followed was legible enough to read without the transcript. His access to the Ashford Meridian files was revoked. His supervisor scheduled a meeting that afternoon and spent 20 minutes explaining, with evident discomfort, that the client had raised concerns about the methodology of the assessment and that Callaway and Reed felt it was best to reassign the engagement. Reassign, Damien said. The client has specific concerns. About the methodology. About the conclusions. He looked at his supervisor, a man named Paul, whom he'd respected, who had the grace to look at the window rather than at Damien while delivering this, and said, "The conclusions follow from the numbers, Paul. That's how this works." "I know that," Paul said, still looking at the window. "Then you know the report is accurate." Paul was quiet for a moment. "I know the client is unhappy." That was the end of the meeting, and effectively the end of Damien's time at Callaway and Reed. He wasn't fired, not directly, not with that word. But the project reassignments dried up. The introductions stopped. The invitations to client meetings disappeared. Within 4 months, he was sitting across from an HR representative being offered a severance package that was fair enough to make refusing it impractical and structured in a way that included a non-disclosure clause he'd had to negotiate carefully before signing. He signed it. He had a daughter who was 2.5, a wife who was trying, and a mortgage. He signed it, he took the severance, and he spent 3 months feeling like a man who'd been mugged by a process so bureaucratic and bloodless that he couldn't even name what had happened to him with any satisfying clarity. And then he started paying attention to Ashford Meridian's finances from the outside. Because that was the other thing about being right. The numbers don't change just because someone takes the report away from you. The story of the next several years was the story of a man who held down a series of jobs, some in finance, some not, while quietly building something that most people who knew him casually had no idea existed. He'd gotten his broker's license back. He'd formed a small LLC. He'd spent 2 years cultivating relationships with private investors who had the patience for a long position and the sophistication to understand what he was building. The investment group that had ultimately purchased a significant block of Ashford Meridian's distressed debt was called Meridian Capital Recovery Group, a name chosen with a particular precision, though most people who encountered it in a filing wouldn't look hard enough to notice. The group had been structured carefully, legally, through every channel it was supposed to go through, with documentation that was meticulous because Damien understood that the day he walked into a room across from Celeste Ashford's lawyers, there could be nothing in his paperwork that wasn't exactly where it was supposed to be. He finished the sandwich. He sat in the parking structure and thought about the look on her face when Hargrove had leaned in and spoken to her. That involuntary stillness, that flicker of something behind her eyes that wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to it. The recognition that something had shifted and she wasn't sure yet how much. He wasn't sure what he'd expected to feel in that moment. He'd imagined it, in the abstract, many times over many years. The satisfying arc of it, the closure. What he actually felt was more complicated. There was something, a warm pressure in the chest that wasn't quite triumph, not the clean version. And underneath it, or maybe next to it, something that felt more like exhaustion. Like a person who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had just set it down and was now standing there, arms empty, trying to remember what his shoulders felt like before. He thought about Maya, asleep with her anglerfish notebook. He started the car. The engine turned over on the second try, which was about what he expected from it. He pulled out of the parking structure and headed home through the mostly empty streets, the city quiet around him in the way cities get quiet only very late at night. And he thought about all the things that hadn't started yet, and about how the hardest part of a long game isn't the beginning, and it isn't even the end. It's the moment after the moment you've been waiting for, when the world doesn't stop and reorganize itself around your vindication, when you still have to drive home and pay the babysitter and check if your kid left the light on in her room again. He did. She had. He turned it off, stood in the doorway of her room for a few seconds, listening to her breathe, and then went to bed. His phone rang twice more before he turned it off. Tomorrow was going to be a very different kind of day. The phone Damien had turned off at 2 in the morning had 17 missed calls by the time he turned it back on at 6:15. He was standing in his kitchen in a t-shirt and sweatpants, waiting for coffee to finish brewing, when he powered it back on and watched the notifications populate the screen, the way water fills a glass. Steadily, without apology, without giving you any choice about it. 17 calls, 11 voicemails, 23 text messages, several of which were from numbers he didn't have saved, which meant they were either journalists or lawyers, and the distinction between those two categories had never felt particularly meaningful to him at 6 in the morning. He poured the coffee. He sat down at the kitchen table, which had a scratch across one corner that Maya had made 8 months ago with a pair of scissors she'd been using for a school project and which he kept meaning to sand down. He read through the texts first, because text told you the shape of a situation faster than voicemails did. Arthur Vance had sent 4. The first, at 11:40 the previous night, Hargrove's office called. They want a meeting. I told them Tuesday. The second at 12:50. Make that Monday. They're not waiting. The third at 2:08, which meant Arthur had been awake considerably later than Damien. 3 board members have been in contact, separately. You need to know that. The fourth, at 5:51 that morning, which suggested Arthur hadn't slept much at all. Call me before 8. Damien called him at 6:20. Arthur picked up on the first ring. I was 61, a former corporate litigator who had spent the last decade doing advisory work for distressed asset funds, and he had the particular vocal energy of someone who found crisis situations genuinely interesting, which was both a professional asset and a personality quirk Damien had learned to work around. You see the financial wire? Arthur said, instead of hello. I just woke up. They're already running with it. 2 outlets. The framing is, and I want you to be prepared for this, the framing is currently Mysterious Investor Ambushes Luxury Hotel Empire. One of them used the word hostile. It's not hostile, it's a debt purchase. We followed I know what it is. I'm telling you what they're saying it is. There's a difference, and right now the difference matters. Arthur paused. There was the sound of papers moving. The three board members who reached out, Forsyth, Nakamura, and one I hadn't expected, a woman named Patricia Holt, who has been on the board for 11 years. They're not calling to yell at you. I want you to understand that. Forsyth specifically used the phrase interested in a conversation. Damien drank his coffee. Okay. That's a significant word, interested. That's a man who's doing math. What about Celeste? Arthur made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Celeste Ashford spent approximately 4 hours on the phone with her legal team last night. Hargrove? You know Hargrove? I've seen him work. Hargrove is good. He's going to look for every angle on the debt documentation, every technical irregularity, anything that creates room to challenge the transfer or the terms. He won't find anything because you didn't leave anything, but he's going to look. And that process is going to take a few days, and during those few days she is going to be, he searched for the word, aggressive. That's fine. I want you to mean that. I mean it. There was a brief silence. Outside the kitchen window, Damien could hear the neighborhood beginning to wake up. A car starting down the block, a dog, something metal moving against concrete. Her PR people released a statement at midnight, Arthur said. I'm going to read it to you. You don't have to. Ashford Meridian is aware of a speculative debt transaction conducted by a party whose motives remain unclear and whose background warrants serious scrutiny. The company is fully committed to protecting its shareholders, employees, and partners from any attempt at opportunistic interference, and we are confident that the strength of our legal position will be demonstrated in the days ahead. End quote. Damien set down his coffee mug. Background warrants serious scrutiny, Arthur repeated. That's the part I want you to sit with for a second. She's going to go after my history. She's going to try to make you into something, a disgruntled former contractor, a man with a grudge, someone whose motives should be questioned so that the substance of what you've actually done can be set aside while everyone argues about your character instead. Arthur's voice was even, practical. I've seen her do this before. She's very good at it. I know, Damien said. I'm the one she practiced on. Maya appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:45 in her pajamas, which had small cartoon turtles on them, rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand. She stopped when she saw her father at the table with the phone against his ear, registered the particular quality of his concentration, and went to pour herself a glass of orange juice with the self-sufficient economy of a child who had learned early that some mornings required a certain amount of independence. Damien wrapped up the call with Arthur, put the phone face down on the table, and looked at his daughter. You have the Greenfield trip today, he said. The aquarium. Field trip. She corrected him with the specific patience of a 9-year-old correcting a 37-year-old. It's a field trip, not a trip. A trip is when you go somewhere far. What's the difference? Permission slips. He almost smiled. Did I sign yours? 2 weeks ago. She looked at him over her juice glass. You were distracted. You signed it in the wrong box, but Mrs. Delaney said it was fine. I'll do better. You always say that. And sometimes I do better. She considered this with the gravity of someone weighing evidence. Sometimes, she agreed. He made her scrambled eggs, which she ate with ketchup in a ratio he found alarming but had stopped commenting on, and he drove her to school, and he stood at the curb for a moment after she'd disappeared through the front doors with her backpack and her anglerfish notebook tucked under one arm. Then he drove to the office. The office was a suite of 4 rooms on the 3rd floor of a building in the financial district that also housed a mid-sized accounting firm and a company that appeared to import kitchen equipment. It wasn't a corner office on the 14th floor. The carpet was the durable commercial kind, the kind that was meant to look like nothing and succeeded. There were 3 desks, a conference table that sat 6, a whiteboard that currently had the words Covenant Review and Timeline and a series of dates written on it, and a framed photograph near the door that Damien had bought at an estate sale because something about it, an old photograph of a harbor, boats on gray water, had seemed like the right kind of thing to have on a wall, even though he couldn't have explained exactly why. Vera Osei was already there when he arrived. She was 34, had a master's in financial economics from Georgetown, and had been with Damien for 3 years. She was the person who had done the majority of the modeling work on the Ashford Meridian debt analysis, and she was also the person who, when Damien had first explained the full scope of what they were building toward, had looked at him for a long moment and said, You know this is going to take years, right? And he'd said he knew, and she'd said, Okay, I just wanted to make sure you weren't expecting this to be fast. And then she'd gone back to her spreadsheet. She had a coffee from the place down the street on her desk and a printout in her hand when he walked in. Financial Tribune ran a piece at 5 a.m., she said, handing it to him. It's mostly speculation, but they got a few things right. Whoever their source is, they have access to something. Damien scanned the printout. The piece was bylined by a reporter named James Whitfield, and it was the kind of piece that happened when a reporter had one real piece of information and padded it carefully to make it look like more. The one real piece was accurate. Meridian Capital Recovery Group had acquired a controlling stake in Ashford Meridian's senior secured debt. The padding was the speculation about motive, the breathless language about boardroom warfare, and a sidebar paragraph about Damien himself that was short, vague, and ended with the phrase, whose prior professional history includes a period of separation from the financial industry. Separation from the financial industry, Damien said. That's elegant, Vera said, without particular inflection. They can't say anything specific because they haven't dug it up yet, but they're telling you they're going to dig. He put the printout on the conference table. What's our timeline looking like? She went to the whiteboard. Covenant review is complete. We've been over this. There are 3 violations that are clearly documentable, and a 4th that we'd want outside counsel to weigh in on before we formally invoke. The notice of default can go out as early as Thursday if we want to move that fast. She paused. Do we want to move that fast? We want to move carefully, Damien said. There's a difference. Hargrove's going to be looking for reasons to challenge the transfer documentation. He won't find any. I know he won't, but the challenge itself creates noise, and noise buys her time. Vera sat down on the edge of her desk, arms crossed, thinking out loud. If we send the default notice Thursday, she responds by Friday, the legal motion lands Monday or Tuesday, we're in a holding pattern for potentially 2 or 3 weeks while that gets resolved, and during those 2 or 3 weeks she has time to move things. Damien looked at the whiteboard. The asset transfers. The asset transfers. Vera's voice shifted slightly, a controlled tightness that meant she was more concerned than she was allowing herself to sound. We have documentation suggesting that 3 property titles have already been moved into family-controlled entities in the last 18 months. If she accelerates that process while we're tied up in a legal challenge, she depletes the collateral. She depletes the collateral, and then we hold debt against a company that's been hollowed out. Vera let that sit for a second. That's not the scenario we built toward. It wasn't. Damien stood at the whiteboard and looked at the dates and the words and thought about the architecture of what he'd spent years constructing, not just the legal and financial structure of it, but the intention underneath it. He hadn't built this to strip a company for parts. He'd built it because the alternative was watching a company that employed 4,000 people get quietly looted by its own leadership, and because somewhere in the back of everything he'd done for the last 7 years was the memory of a report he'd written that was accurate and that had been buried, and the particular variety of injury that comes not from being attacked, but from being made to disappear. That was what she'd done to him, really. She hadn't fired him, she'd had the company fire him, through a process so layered in corporate language that he could barely describe it to Claire afterward without it sounding like he was paranoid. She hadn't discredited his report. She'd had it set aside, reclassified, quietly removed from consideration, so that the bond offering could proceed and the expansion could continue, and the uncomfortable arithmetic of Damien Cross could be treated as a rounding error. He had not forgotten what that felt like. He also hadn't spent 7 years building something just to become a version of the thing he was building against. Get me Marcus Webb on the phone, he said. Vera raised her eyebrows slightly. The board member Marcus Webb? I thought he was in her corner. He was, 18 months ago. People's corners shift when the math shifts. Damien picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. Also, I need you to pull everything we have on a man named Raymond Chu, former CFO, left Ashford Meridian about 2 years ago. I want to know where he landed and whether he's reachable. Vera wrote the name down. Why Chu specifically? Because he was there when the asset transfers started, Damien said, and he left 6 months after they began, which means either he didn't know what was happening or he knew and he left because of it. He paused. I want to find out which one. The call with Marcus Webb happened at 10:30, patched through to Damien's cell while he was sitting in the conference room with Vera and their outside counsel, a compact, sharp-edged woman named Leslie Park, who billed at a rate that reminded Damien every month why efficiency mattered. Webb was on the Ashford Meridian board and had been for 6 years. He was in his late 60s, had made his money in commercial real estate, and had the careful, deliberate speech pattern of a man who had learned to think about sentences before he said them. "Mr. Cross," he said when the call connected. "Not hostile. Measuring. Mr. Webb, I appreciate you taking the time. I'm going to be direct with you. Please. The board is—" Webb stopped, chose again. "The board is not unified on how to respond to your position. There are members who are prepared to follow Miss. And you've spent, what, 7 years building toward this?" "I spent 7 years building a fund," Damien said carefully. "The Ashford Meridian position is one part of a larger portfolio. It happens to be the most significant part, for reasons that aren't purely financial. That's a long time to carry something." "It is. I'm going to ask you something, and I'd like a straight answer." "All right. Is this about the company, or is this about her?" Damien looked at the whiteboard across the conference room. Vera was watching him. Leslie was watching the table. "Both," he said, "but not in the way she's going to say it is." Webb was quiet for a moment. "Tuesday," he said. "I can make a call, get you in front of a small group, 3, maybe 4 board members. Informal. Off the record. You present your position directly, not through counsel. That's acceptable. Don't bring lawyers." "I'll bring one," Damien said. "But she'll sit in the corner and not say anything unless someone tries to misrepresent our legal position." Something in Webb's voice suggested this might have amused him, though he kept it contained. "Tuesday at 9. I'll send the location." The call ended. Leslie looked up from the table. "He's not an ally." "No. He's a man who wants to understand which way the ship is going before he decides which side to stand on." "That's fine," Damien said. "That's actually better. Allies can become liabilities. A man who follows the math stays predictable." He didn't hear from Raymond Chu until late that afternoon. Vera had tracked him through a series of professional registrations and a consulting LLC that Chu had formed after leaving Ashford Meridian, and Damien had left a message through an intermediary, brief, specific, containing just enough information to communicate that Damien knew what he knew, without specifying exactly how much he knew. It was the kind of message that was either going to be ignored completely or was going to get a call back within 4 hours. It got a call back in 3. Raymond Chu was 53, had a voice that sounded like he'd been sleeping badly for a while, and opened the conversation with, "How much do you actually have?" "Enough," Damien said. "That's not an answer." "No, but it's what I'm offering right now." Damien was at his desk, jacket off, the late afternoon light coming in sideways through the window. "I'm not building a case against you, Mr. Chu. I'm building a picture of what happened. You're a part of that picture whether you talk to me or not. The question is what part?" A long pause. The sound of someone in a room somewhere deciding something. "I left because of the Hartwell transfers," Chu said. "The 3 property titles. I found them in a subsidiary audit in the spring. I raised it internally." He stopped. "I was told the transfers were a legitimate restructuring of the asset portfolio for tax efficiency purposes." "Were they?" "The documentation said they were. The timing didn't support that." His voice had a flat, careful quality, like a man reading from a prepared statement, except there was no statement. Just a man who had been carrying something heavy for 2 years and was now deciding in real time whether to set it down. "When I pushed further, I was removed from the Audit Oversight Committee. 3 weeks later, I was offered a package." "Did you take it?" "I have 2 kids in college," Chu said. "Yes, I took it." "And the documentation?" Another pause, longer. "The documentation that I retained as part of my personal due diligence during the course of my employment," Chu said very carefully, "exists. And it is currently in the possession of my attorney. And my attorney has been waiting for the right context in which to consider its use." Damien closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the late light was still coming through the window, and the harbor photograph was on the wall, and Vera was standing in the doorway of his office, looking at him with an expression that asked the question without asking it. He gave her a small nod. "Mr. Chu," he said, "I think this conversation has just gotten significantly more useful. Are you available to meet in person?" "When?" "Wednesday." "Where?" "Somewhere quiet," Damien said. "Somewhere that isn't Midtown." The line was quiet for a moment. "I know a place," Chu said. The place Raymond Chu knew turned out to be a diner in a neighborhood that hadn't been gentrified yet and showed no particular interest in becoming so. It was called Patty's, which was either the name of the owner or a reference to something else entirely, and the sign outside had a letter missing, so it read Pate Was, which nobody had apparently felt the need to fix. The booths were the original vinyl, cracked in places and repaired with electrical tape, in at least 2 spots Damien could see from where he sat. The coffee came in a ceramic mug that had been washed so many times the pattern on the side had faded to a suggestion. It was exactly the kind of place where nobody would see them, because nobody who might recognize either of them would be caught dead there, and also because it was 11:30 on a Wednesday morning, and the only other occupied table was a retired-looking man in a fishing hat reading a newspaper with the focused intensity of someone for whom this was the main event of the day. Chu arrived 4 minutes late, which Damien registered and filed away as the behavior of a man who was nervous but still trying to maintain the appearance of control. He was trim, dark-haired going gray at the temples, and he sat down across from Damien with the careful movements of someone conscious of being observed, even in a room where nobody was observing them. They shook hands. The waitress came. Both men ordered coffee and neither ordered food, which the waitress absorbed without comment. "You brought someone," Chu said, glancing toward the corner booth where Leslie Park sat with a legal pad and a pen, and the professional stillness of a person who had been told to sit in the corner and not say anything. "My counsel," Damien said. "She's here to listen." "I'd rather this was, I know, but I'd rather have accurate records of what's said. It protects you as much as it protects me." Chu looked at Leslie again, then back at Damien. He seemed to do a brief internal calculation and then accept the result, the way people accept math. They don't like when they can't find the error. "All right," he said. The coffee came. Damien waited while Chu added 2 sugars and stirred, the small ritual of it serving as the kind of transition a person needs sometimes before they can start saying the hard things. "The Hartwell transfers," Damien said when Chu had set down the spoon. "Walk me through what you found." Chu took a breath. 3 properties. The Hartwell Chicago, the Hartwell Napa, and the coastal property in Carolina they call the Meridian Cove, though it's been off-brand for operational purposes since 2021. Combined assessed value at the time of transfer, approximately $340 million. He paused. They were moved into entities controlled by members of Celeste Ashford's family, a brother-in-law, a cousin, and a holding company registered in Delaware whose beneficial ownership, when I traced it through the subsidiary structure, terminated in a trust with her daughter's name on it. Damien's hands were flat on the table. He didn't move them. "The transfers were documented as intra-company restructuring," Chu continued. "The internal memos described them as tax optimization measures. The legal sign-off was done by outside counsel, a firm I didn't recognize, which should have been the first flag because Ashford Meridian had used the same 2 firms for 20 years. "When did you find it?" "March 2022. I was running a subsidiary audit that was supposed to be routine, insurance liability reconciliation, not even financial in scope, just making sure the property insurance schedules matched the actual titled ownership. That's when I saw the titles didn't match. The insurance still listed the properties under Ashford Meridian subsidiaries. The titles had already moved. So the insurance documentation and the title documentation were contradicting each other. For approximately 8 months. Chu wrapped both hands around his coffee mug, which means either the legal team on the transfers forgot to notify the insurance department, or, more likely, they did it intentionally to maintain the appearance of continuity on the insurance side while the actual ownership had already moved. "And when you raised it?" "I went to the general counsel first." That was Strickland, Patrick Strickland. He's still in the role. He told me it had been reviewed and cleared and that I was looking at documentation that was accurate as of the date it was filed, but that the company had subsequently undergone a legitimate restructuring. Chu's voice had a quiet, tired bitterness underneath its control. He said it the way you say something to a person you're hoping will be satisfied with a sentence and go away. You weren't satisfied. I'm a CFO. I'm professionally required to not be satisfied. He looked at the table. I put together a memo. 7 pages. I laid out the sequence, the titles, the insurance discrepancy, the holding company structure. I sent it to Strickland and copied it to the chairman of the audit committee. "Patricia Holt," Damien said. Chu looked up. "You know her?" "I know she's been on the board for 11 years. I know she's been in contact with at least one other board member since the gala. Damien watched Chu's face. What did she do with your memo? She requested a meeting with me and Strickland together, 2 days later. Chu shifted in this booth. In that meeting, Strickland presented a revised set of documentation that he said had been incorrectly filed previously, and that the new documents represented the actual record of the restructuring. The revised documentation had different dates on it. The diner was quiet, except for the man in the fishing hat turning a page. Different dates, Damien said. The original transfer agreements I'd found were dated October and November of 2021. The revised documentation Strickland presented showed dates in December 2020. Chu looked at Damien steadily. 18 months earlier, which would have placed the transfers before the debt covenant restrictions came into effect. Damien understood immediately. The debt agreements Ashford Meridian had entered into in early 2021 contained asset disposition covenants, standard provisions prohibiting the company from moving significant assets without lender approval. If the transfers happened after those covenants were in place, they were violations. If the revised documentation placing them in December 2020 was accurate, they predated the restrictions entirely. The revised documents were fabricated, Damien said. I believe they were fabricated, Chu said carefully. I cannot prove it in a courtroom without forensic document analysis. What I can tell you is that I reviewed both sets of documents, and there were inconsistencies in formatting, in font rendering, and in the metadata signatures that made the revised versions look like they had been produced more recently than their stated dates. What did you do? I told Patricia Holt privately, after the meeting, that I had concerns about the provenance of the revised documentation. He paused. She listened. She took notes. She said she would look into it. He paused again, longer. 6 weeks later, I was offered the package. Damien sat back slightly. And Holt? Stayed on the board. Chu's voice was flat, but not without feeling. I don't know what she did with what I told her. Maybe nothing. Maybe she looked into it and concluded there wasn't enough to move on. Maybe she was warned off. He shrugged, a small movement that carried a great deal of weight. I took the package. I told myself I'd find the right moment. The right moment is now. I know why it's now for you, Chu said. I'm asking why it should be now for me. It was a fair question. Damien had expected it. Because she's accelerating, Damien said. The asset transfers started in 2021. There have been 2 more since you left. I have documentation on both. She's moving things faster because she can see what's coming. He kept his voice level, not dramatic, just factual. If we don't have the documentation in place before she completes the transfer of the remaining significant assets, then whatever action we take will be against a hollowed structure. The employees who work for this company, 4,000 of them, will be left holding a company that's been stripped of its most valuable collateral. Chu was quiet. I'm not asking you to do this for me, Damien said. I'm asking you to do it because you already decided it was the right thing. You wrote the memo. You told Holt. You kept the documentation for 2 years and didn't destroy it. He looked across the table. You didn't keep it because you were planning to do nothing. Another quiet. Longer than the ones before. My attorney will need to be involved, Chu said. Of course. And I want an understanding, not a formal agreement, not something written right now, just an understanding, that the purpose of using this documentation is to correct the record and protect the company's assets, not to prosecute, not to... He stopped. I worked with some of these people for 8 years. I'm not interested in being the instrument of something that goes beyond what the situation actually requires. Damien thought about how to answer that honestly. I can't make promises about what other parties do with documented evidence of securities violations, he said. That's outside my control, and I won't pretend otherwise. What I can tell you is that my objective is restructuring, not destruction. I want the company to come out the other side of this functional. That requires documentation of what happened, not because I want to punish anyone, but because you can't fix something if you're not allowed to accurately describe what's broken. Chu looked at him for a long moment. Whatever he was measuring, he apparently reached a number. I'll have my attorney call yours, he said. The Tuesday board meeting that Marcus Webb had arranged was not the full board. It was 4 members. Webb, Nakamura, a man named Gerald Forsyth, who had the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms where significant decisions were made and was no longer impressed by them, and Patricia Holt. Holt was 64, small-framed, with the kind of precise, watchful quality that made Damien think she'd been the smartest person in a lot of rooms without advertising it. She shook his hand when he came in and said nothing beyond his name, which told him something. The meeting was in a conference room in a building that had nothing to do with Ashford Meridian, Webb's building, on a floor that wasn't publicly associated with any company. The precaution was deliberate, and Damien respected it. He came in with Leslie, who sat in the corner as agreed. He spent the first 20 minutes laying out the financial position clearly and without theater, the debt structure, the covenant language, the specific violations he had documented, and what the technical mechanics of a default notice would look like. He'd brought materials but kept them spare, a 6-page summary document that was dense with specific numbers and short on adjectives. Nakamura asked the sharpest questions, mostly about the timeline of the default notice and what remedy options existed short of full enforcement. Forsyth asked 2 questions and then mostly listened, which told Damien that Forsyth had already made up his mind about something and was waiting to see if what he heard confirmed it. Webb asked about the 2017 report. "I'm told," Webb said, "that there was an independent financial assessment conducted by a Callaway and Reed analyst that year that the company did not act on." "That's accurate," Damien said. "You wrote it." "I did." Webb looked at him with the kind of direct attention that older men of significant experience deploy when they want to understand something without asking more than one question. "Why didn't you act then? You could have made noise, gone to the financial press." "I had a non-disclosure provision in my severance. I complied with it." Damien paused. "And I didn't have anything actionable then. The report was an assessment of risk. It wasn't documentation of wrongdoing." "But you believed it would eventually become documentation of wrongdoing." "I believed the math would eventually be what the math was." "Yes." Webb seemed to consider that. 7 years is a long time to be patient. "It is," Damien said, "but I had a daughter to raise and a fund to build, and patience is easier when you have other things to do." Patricia Holt, who had been quiet through most of the meeting, spoke for the first time with the particular suddenness of someone who has been holding a sentence ready for a while. "Mr. Cross," she said, "are you aware of the Hartwell property transfers?" The room shifted slightly. Not visibly. Nobody moved, but Damien felt it. He looked at her. "Yes." "And do you have documentation relevant to those transfers?" "I have documentation of the transfers themselves. I have additional documentation that I am currently in the process of organizing with outside counsel." He chose the next words carefully. "I believe you may be aware of some of the same concerns from a prior internal discussion." Holt's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. "The prior discussion you're referring to was conducted in confidence," she said. "I'm not citing you as a source. I'm telling you that the concerns raised 2 years ago didn't disappear because the person who raised them accepted a package and left." The room was very quiet. Forsyth uncapped his pen and wrote something on his notepad. Damien couldn't see what it was. "What exactly are you asking this group to do?" Holt said. "Formally. I'm not asking anything formally today," Damien said. "Formally, I have a legal position and a documented set of covenant violations and a timeline for issuing a default notice. None of that requires your cooperation. It follows from the documentation we have and the agreements Ashford Meridian entered into." "Then why are we here?" Nakamura said. "Because a default notice that triggers legal enforcement produces one kind of outcome," Damien said. "A board that acts preemptively to address documented governance failures produces a different kind of outcome. I'm here because I think the second outcome is better for this company and for everyone who works for it." He looked around the table. "I'm here because a board that waits to be forced produces a worse result than a board that leads." Forsyth looked up from his notepad. "What's the timeline on the default notice?" "We can hold it for 10 days, Damien said. "That's as long as I can responsibly delay it, given what we know about the asset transfers in progress." 10 days, Webb said. 10 days. Nobody said anything for a moment. "I want to be clear about something," Holt said. "Whatever action this board takes will be based on its fiduciary obligations to the company and its stakeholders, not on a personal dispute between you and Ms. Ashford." "That's exactly the basis it should be taken on," Damien said. The meeting ended 40 minutes later without any formal commitment from anyone, which was exactly what Damien had expected and which was, in its own way, a form of progress. Leslie waited until they were in the elevator before speaking. Holt knows, she said. She's known for 2 years. She's carrying it like someone who couldn't act then and is looking for a reason to act now. Yes, Damien said, we're going to give her one. The smear campaign started on Thursday. It came through 3 channels roughly simultaneously, which told Damien it had been coordinated rather than spontaneous. The first was a post on a financial industry blog, the kind of blog that had enough credibility to be cited but not enough to be fully accountable, that raised questions about the regulatory history of Meridian Capital Recovery Group and mentioned, with careful vagueness, prior professional conduct concerns related to its principal. The second was a call to a journalist at a business publication, not Whitfield this time, a different reporter, that resulted in an inquiry to Arthur Vance's office asking for comment on allegations of market manipulation related to the Ashford Meridian debt purchase. There were no actual allegations. There was no actual regulatory action. There was an inquiry, and the inquiry itself was the weapon, because a reporter asking about allegations creates a sentence that can read as though the allegations are real, regardless of what the actual answer is. The third channel was personal. A woman Damien had dated briefly 2 years ago, 3 dates, genuinely nothing. They'd ended it by mutual agreement and on reasonable terms, was contacted by someone she described to Damien when she called him that Thursday afternoon as a woman who said she was doing background research for a profile. The researcher had asked questions that were personal in a way that didn't correspond to any actual journalism. She wanted to know about Maya, the woman, whose name was Diane, said. Her voice was careful. About who watches her when you work evenings. About whether... She stopped. She made it sound like a welfare thing, like someone had raised concerns. Damien was standing in the parking lot outside his building when this call came in. He did not move for a moment. What did you tell her? He said. I told her I didn't know what she was talking about and that she should stop calling me. A pause. Damien, I didn't say anything that I know, he said. Thank you for calling me. He stood in the parking lot after he hung up, in the October air that had turned cold in the way October air does, when it's reminding you that something harder is coming. He thought about Maya, who was at school right now, probably drawing an anglerfish in the margins of her math worksheet. He thought about Celeste Ashford, who had moved from attacking his professional record to probing around the edges of his personal life, and who had specifically, deliberately, directed someone to ask questions about his daughter. He felt something that he didn't try to dress up in more neutral language. I was angry. Not the cold, managed, productive variety of anger he'd been working with for 7 years. Something hotter than that, less organized. The kind of anger that comes from something being touched that shouldn't have been touched. He stood in the parking lot and let himself feel it for about 90 seconds. Then he called Arthur. She went personal, he said when Arthur picked up. A pause. How personal? She had someone contact a person I know and ask questions about my daughter. Arthur was quiet for a moment. That's a mistake on her part, he said. Not a legal mistake, not yet, but a mistake in judgment. People who go after children when they're in a business dispute usually regret it because it tells everyone watching what they're actually afraid of. I need the default notice ready to go, Damien said. I want to have it drafted and reviewed by Friday. I thought we were holding... We're holding. I'm not saying we send it Friday. I'm saying I want it ready Friday. His voice was even again. The 90 seconds were over. And I need you to make sure our documentation on the Hartwell transfers is in a format that's ready to be presented to a board in a formal session, not a summary. The full documentation, organized and indexed. That's going to be a substantial package. Then we'd better start tonight. He drove to school pickup at 3:15, which he didn't always make, and which surprised Maya enough that she stopped walking toward the line of cars and stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking at him with the particular expression of a child recalibrating an expectation. You're here, she said. I'm here. She got in the car. She put her backpack between her feet and looked out the window as they pulled out of the school parking lot. How was the aquarium? He asked. He meant the field trip from Monday. He'd forgotten to ask properly. Good. We saw a giant Pacific octopus. Were you scared? Of an octopus? Some people are. Some people are scared of a lot of things, she said, with the serene judgment of a 9-year-old who had not yet accumulated enough fear to be defensive about the concept. The octopus was in a tank. It can't hurt you if it's in a tank. He drove for a block without saying anything. Dad, Maya said. Yeah, you're doing the quiet thing. What quiet thing? The thing where you go quiet, but it's not the regular quiet. It's the loud quiet. He looked at her briefly. The loud quiet. Where it's quiet, but something is loud inside it. She seemed entirely comfortable with this description and its apparent strangeness. You do it sometimes at dinner, and sometimes when you're driving. He thought about what to say. He thought about lying, the comfortable parent lie of everything's fine, and then he thought about what it cost a child to grow up hearing that sentence when it wasn't true. I'm handling something at work, he said. It's complicated, but I'm handling it. She absorbed this. Is it the thing from the other night? The hotel? He looked at her again, more sharply this time. You were on the phone a lot, she said, and you had your serious face for 3 days. And Mrs. Okafor said something about a newspaper thing when she thought I wasn't listening. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. It's related to that. Are you in trouble? No, the opposite, actually. She seemed to consider what the opposite of trouble might look like, and whether it sounded better. Okay, she said. They drove the rest of the way home mostly in silence, but a different kind, the ordinary kind, the one without anything loud inside it. When they got home, she went to the kitchen table and started her homework without being asked, which happened approximately once a month, and which Damien registered as the universe offering him something small and unrequested. He stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at her. Then he went to the bedroom that served as his home office, sat down at the desk, opened his laptop, and began reviewing the Hartwell transfer documentation for what felt like the 40th time, looking for anything he might have missed, any gap that Hargrove could find before they did, and use to complicate what was coming. He found 2 things he wanted to strengthen, and nothing he'd missed, which was about what he expected, which was not the same as being comforted by it. Outside the window, the evening came down over the city the way it always did, regardless of what was happening inside any particular building or any particular life. Indifferently, on schedule, with no opinion about any of it. The default notice went out on Friday at 9 a.m., delivered simultaneously by electronic filing and certified mail to Ashford Meridian's registered legal address and to Hargrove's office directly. Arthur had wanted to send it Thursday. Damien had held it one more day, not out of hesitation, but because he'd spent Thursday evening on a call with Vera and Leslie going through every line of the supporting documentation one final time, looking for anything that could be challenged, anything that Hargrove could pull on to create delay. They found nothing they hadn't already addressed. By 9 Friday morning, the document was moving through the appropriate channels, and by 9:15, Arthur had confirmation of receipt. By 10 o'clock, 3 financial news outlets had picked up the filing. Damien was at the office when the coverage started coming in. Vera had set up a basic media monitoring feed that pushed alerts to a shared screen in the conference room, and he stood in front of it for about 10 minutes, reading the headlines with the particular detachment of someone watching something they built finally move through the world at its own speed. There was a quality to that experience he hadn't anticipated. Not satisfaction exactly, not relief. Something closer to the sensation of having held a very taut wire for a very long time and finally feeling the tension transfer somewhere else. The language in the financial press was more specific now than it had been on the morning after the gala. Less speculation, more documentation. The covenant violations were on record. The default notice was on record. James Whitfield, who had been circling this story for days, published a piece by noon that was substantially more accurate than his first attempt, and which included a quote from Arthur Vance that had been carefully pre-approved. Meridian Capital Recovery Group has acted entirely within the terms of the applicable debt agreements and has provided appropriate notice in accordance with those agreements. Our position is well documented, and our intentions with respect to the company's long-term viability are constructive. Constructive. Damien had chosen that word himself. It was the right word because it was accurate, and because it was the word that would eventually matter most to the people he most needed to matter to. Celeste Ashford's response came through Hargrove at 11:15, a formal legal letter contesting the validity of the default notice on 3 grounds, each of which Leslie had anticipated and documented responses to. Hargrove was good. The letter was precise and structured, and it was going to require actual legal engagement to address rather than dismissal, which was its purpose. It bought Celeste time, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3, depending on how quickly a judge looked at the filing if she pushed it to court. What it didn't do was stop anything. Marcus Webb called at 1 in the afternoon. "You sent the notice," he said. "I told you I would." "I know you did." A brief pause. "I'm calling to tell you that there will be an emergency board meeting, Monday." Damien had not expected Monday. He'd expected the board to move, but not quite this fast. "Who called it?" "Patricia Holt requested it. I seconded. We have quorum." Another pause. "Celeste will be there." "I assumed she would be." "She's going to come in prepared to fight, Damien. I want you to understand that. She's been building this company for 20 years. She's not going to walk out of a conference room." "I'm not asking her to walk out of a conference room," Damien said. "I'm asking the board to fulfill its fiduciary obligations." "Those can be the same thing, depending on what the board decides." "Yes," Damien said, "they can." There was a quality in Webb's silence that suggested he was doing some final internal accounting of something. What exactly, Damien couldn't know. Then Webb said, "I want you to present your full documentation at the meeting. Everything. The covenant violations, the Hartwell transfers, the supporting documentation from your additional sources. Don't leave anything in reserve for a second meeting, because there won't be a second meeting." "All right." "And I want it organized. I've seen boards lose the thread in document-heavy presentations because whoever was presenting couldn't find the page they needed. I want it organized so that anyone in that room can follow it without having to be an analyst." "Understood." Monday, 9 a.m., the Ashford Meridian corporate offices, 43rd floor. A brief dry pause. "I assume you know the address." He knew the address. The weekend was strange. Not bad. Strange in the specific way that weekends are strange when something large is pending and the world around you continues being ordinary regardless. Maya had a birthday party on Saturday for a classmate whose name Damien couldn't quite retain. He drove her there, waited in the car in the parking lot of a roller skating rink for 2 hours reading through the board presentation on his laptop, then drove her home. She smelled like birthday cake and was in high spirits and told him on the way home that a boy named Connor had fallen down 4 times and hadn't cried once, which she reported with a combination of admiration and scientific detachment that reminded him, oddly, of Vera. Sunday he took her to the Natural History Museum, because she'd asked twice, and because he understood that the correct response to a child who has asked twice for something that costs $12 and requires 3 hours of your time is to do it. She stood in front of the deep-sea exhibit for 20 minutes, making detailed notes in her anglerfish notebook, moving between panels with the focused efficiency of a professional researcher who happened to be 4.5 feet tall. He watched her and thought about the things he was walking into on Monday and tried, for a couple of hours, to not think about them. He mostly succeeded. Sunday night, he didn't sleep well. He lay in the dark and ran the presentation in his head, the order of the documents, the sequence of the argument, where the vulnerabilities were, where Hargrove or Celeste herself might try to interrupt or redirect. He'd done enough presentations in enough difficult rooms to know that the thing that derails most of them isn't missing information. It's the moment when someone says something unexpected and the presenter gets pulled off their thread. He ran through the unexpected things. He tried to run through all of them. At 2 in the morning, he got up, drank a glass of water, stood at the kitchen window looking at the street. The neighborhood was completely quiet. One streetlight was doing the faint, intermittent flicker that it had been doing for 6 months, which the city apparently had no immediate plans to fix. He thought about the version of himself that had sat across from Paul at Callaway and Reed, and heard the words, "The client is unhappy," used as a substitute for "you were right." He thought about Claire packing a bag in the hallway of the house they'd rented in the 3rd year of their marriage. Not in anger, nothing dramatic, just the quiet logistics of a woman who had made a decision. And the conversation they'd had at the kitchen table that night that had been, in its way, more honest than most of the conversations they'd had when things were better. He thought about the particular texture of starting over in your early 30s with a daughter who was not yet 2 and a career that needed to be rebuilt and no particular clarity about how any of it was going to resolve. He thought, I am not the same person who sat across from Paul. He didn't mean it as a triumphant thing. He just meant it as a fact. People become different people through time and difficulty and the accumulation of choices that nobody witnesses. He was different. Whether he was better was a question he'd leave for someone else to assess. He went back to bed at 2:30 and slept until 6. The 43rd floor of the Ashford Meridian corporate tower had the particular quality of spaces that have been designed to communicate power to the people who enter them. The elevator opened directly into a reception area with high ceilings and the kind of understated, expensive design that costs more the less it looks like it cost anything. The receptionist, a young man in a dark suit who appeared to have been briefed on Damien's arrival, was professionally neutral in the way that suggested he had been told to be professionally neutral and was executing that instruction with some effort. Damien arrived at 8:45. Leslie was with him, carrying the document portfolio. Vera was not. They'd agreed that her presence would read as aggressive in a way that wasn't useful, and Vera had agreed with this assessment in the tone of someone who was somewhat annoyed to have to agree with it. Arthur was there by phone, available if needed. The conference room they were shown to was long and glass-walled, looking out over the city from 43 floors up. 8 chairs around the table. Damien counted them and identified, from the place settings and the water glasses and the information packets at each seat, prepared by Hargrove's office, he assumed, who was expected to be present. 6 board members, Hargrove, and Celeste. The board members arrived over the next 10 minutes in the compressed, slightly tense way of people who have been summoned to something they didn't expect to be summoned to. Webb came in first, nodded at Damien, took a seat at the far end. Nakamura arrived and sat without looking at anyone in particular. Forsyth came in reading something on his phone that he finished before sitting down. 2 members Damien had had no prior interaction with, a woman named Adaeze Okonkwo, who ran a private equity firm, and a man named Bruce Halliday, who had made his money in logistics, arrived together and sat adjacent to each other with the closeness of people who had already talked. Patricia Holt came in last of the board members and sat at the center of one side of the table, directly across from where Damien would be sitting. She looked at him when she sat down. A long look, neutral in its surface, but carrying something underneath it that Damien read as a kind of resolution. The look of someone who had been waiting for a room like this and had arrived ready. Hargrove took the seat nearest the door. He was silver-haired and efficient, and he looked at Damien across the table with the careful, opponent's attention of a man who had spent 2 weeks trying to find a weakness and hadn't found one he could use but wasn't prepared to say so yet. Came in at 9:03. She was in a dark charcoal suit, her posture exactly what it had been in the ballroom 12 days ago, straight, deliberate, assembled. She walked to the head of the table and sat down without looking at Damien and placed her hands flat on the table in front of her, and the whole sequence of it was so controlled that Damien understood it for what it was, a performance of control, which was different from control itself. Marcus Webb opened the meeting with a brief procedural statement about purpose and standing and then turned it over to Holt, who had formally requested the session. Holt spoke for 4 minutes. She was precise and she was without drama. She cited specific covenant provisions, specific dates, and the existence of documentation that the board had not previously been presented with in its complete form. She said that in her role as a board member with fiduciary obligations, she was requesting that the documentation be presented to the full board before any legal challenge to the default notice was formally pursued on the company's behalf. Then she said, "I'm also requesting that certain internal documents, whose existence I became aware of approximately 2 years ago, and which I did not act on adequately at the time, be entered into the record of this meeting." That last sentence produced a silence that was different from the silences that had come before it. Forsyth looked up from his notepad. Okonkwo turned slightly toward Holt. Bruce Halliday looked at the table. Celeste said, "Patricia?" "I'm not finished," Holt said. Her voice was very quiet and very firm. "I want that on the record." Celeste looked at her for a moment. Something moved across her face, something complex, something that had been a long time coming. Then she looked at the window. Webb said, "Mr. Cross, please proceed." Damien had done this before, not this exactly, but the category of thing. The room that doesn't want to hear what you're about to say, the evidence that makes people uncomfortable, not because it's wrong, but because it's right. And being right is going to require everyone in the room to do something difficult. He'd learned in those earlier rooms that the worst thing you could do was oversell it. The worst thing you could do was make it feel like a prosecution. So he didn't. He walked through the documentation the way he would have walked through a financial analysis for a client who was trying to understand what they were looking at. Steady, specific, without performance. He put documents on the screen one at a time, identified each one, explained what it showed and what it meant in the context of the debt agreements. He cross-referenced the covenant language with the transfer documentation. He showed the timeline of the asset movements, the entities involved, the beneficial ownership structure behind the Delaware holding company. When he got to the Hartwell transfers, he showed both sets of documentation, the original dates Chu had found and the revised documentation Strickland had presented at the meeting 2 years ago. He did not say fabricated. He said, "These two sets of documents contain contradictory date information that cannot both be accurate. The board may wish to commission forensic document analysis to establish which dates are correct." He didn't need to say more. The room understood. Hargrove interjected twice, both times with specific technical objections, one about the methodology of the covenant interpretation, one about the chain of custody of the transfer documents. Both times Leslie responded from her corner without raising her voice, and with the particular precision of someone who had anticipated both objections and had prepared 2 pages of response to each. Hargrove didn't object a third time. The presentation took 41 minutes. When Damien finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Celeste broke it. "This is a hostile action by a disgruntled former contractor," she said, "who has spent years constructing a financial position for the sole purpose of damaging this company and damaging me personally. Every document in that presentation has been selected and framed to support a predetermined conclusion." Her voice was steady, impressively steady. "The board should be asking itself why a man who was hired briefly by a vendor firm 7 years ago has invested this level of personal and financial resource into a campaign against a company he has no legitimate stake in. He owns a controlling position in our senior secured debt," Nakamura said. "That's a legitimate stake. He purchased that position specifically to manufacture leverage. That's how debt markets work," Nakamura said. Not unkindly, just factually. Celeste looked at Damien directly for the first time since entering the room. "You wrote a report that was flawed. You were removed from a project because the report was inadequate. You've been telling yourself a different story about that for 7 years because the alternative is accepting that you were simply wrong." Damien looked at her. He'd thought about what he would say if she said something like this. He'd prepared several versions of a response. What came out was none of them. "The bond offering you proceeded with after my report was set aside," he said, "raised capital at terms that required sustained market conditions that didn't materialize. The European properties I identified as overvalued by 30 to 40% were written down by 36% within 4 years. The debt refinancing timeline I described as requiring unlikely consecutive favorable conditions required emergency renegotiation twice." He kept his voice level. "The report wasn't flawed. It was accurate. And you knew it was accurate when you had it buried." The room was very still. "That's not why I'm here," Damien said. "I'm here because of what came after the report. Because the same judgment that led to burying accurate financial analysis led to the asset transfers in this documentation. Because the same pattern applies." He looked at the table, not at her. "I'm not asking this board to punish Celeste Ashford. I'm asking it to stop a process that, if it continues for another 6 months, will leave this company's secured creditors with a hollowed structure and 4,000 employees with an uncertain future." Gerald Forsyth, who had barely spoken, put down his pen. "What exactly are you proposing?" he said. "Independent restructuring oversight. A restructuring officer appointed by the board, with full access to the company's financial records and the authority to suspend any further asset disposition pending completion of the process." Damien paused. "I'm willing to participate in that process. I'm not insisting on leading it." Forsyth looked at him for a moment. "You're willing to participate, but not to lead. The goal is a functional company. That doesn't require me to be in charge of it." Forsyth picked up his pen again and wrote something. What happened next was not quick, and it was not clean. It was a board meeting, which meant it was a room full of people with different interests trying to find a position they could all live with while under significant pressure and with incomplete information about how various things were going to resolve legally. There were side conversations and procedural motions, and one moment when Hargrove and Leslie had a rapid, low-voiced technical exchange in the corner that lasted 4 minutes and resolved nothing visibly. Celeste argued. She was good at it, not desperate, not shrill, but strategic in the way she'd always been strategic, shifting her position in response to the room, finding the arguments that had traction and abandoning the ones that didn't. She questioned the documentation. She questioned the process. She raised the specter of legal action against individual board members for breach of fiduciary duty if they acted without proper due diligence, which was itself a sophisticated move because it introduced a cost to the board for acting. Holt responded to that one. The greater breach of fiduciary duty, Holt said, is failing to act on documented evidence of asset transfers that may have violated debt agreements and harmed the company's creditors. I should have acted on that evidence 2 years ago. I didn't. That's something I'll carry. She looked at Celeste. But I'm not going to compound it. At 11:40, Marcus Webb called for a vote. The motion was to appoint an independent restructuring officer with the authority Damien had described, pending a full forensic review of the Hartwell transfer documentation, and to suspend further asset dispositions pending that review. 5 in favor. 1 abstention, Bruce Halliday, who was looking at his water glass when his name was called, and said abstain in the voice of a man trying to remain in as many possible futures as possible. 1 opposed, a board member named Rice, whom Damien hadn't spoken with and who voted no with the flat conviction of someone who had decided before entering the room. Celeste did not vote. She was not a board member. She sat at the head of the table and watched the vote happen with the face of someone watching something that she had spent a long time believing she could prevent. When Webb announced the result, she stood up. She didn't say anything immediately. She gathered the portfolio in front of her with the careful, deliberate movements of someone maintaining composure through physical precision, straightening papers that didn't need to be straightened, capping a pen. Then she looked at Damien. There was something in her expression that he hadn't expected. Not fury. He'd expected fury, or contempt, or the particular cold superiority she'd deployed in the ballroom 12 days ago when she'd looked at him across a spilled wine glass and told someone to get him off the floor. What he saw instead was something more complicated. Recognition, maybe. The look of a person seeing the shape of something they've been avoiding seeing for a long time. She didn't speak to him. She looked at him for perhaps 3 seconds, and then she walked out of the conference room without looking at anyone else. Hargrove followed her, already on his phone. The remaining board members sat in the aftermath of the vote with the specific collective exhaustion of people who have just made a significant decision and are now beginning to understand what it requires. Webb looked at Damien. We'll need a recommendation for the restructuring officer by end of week. I have names, Damien said. I assumed you did. Leslie was already making notes. Forsyth was talking quietly to Okonkwo. Patricia Holt was sitting with her hands folded on the table, looking at the middle distance. Not upset exactly, but carrying something. The weight of 2 years of a decision deferred and the specific, uncomfortable relief of having finally made it. Damien gathered his materials. He nodded to Webb. He thanked Holt. A brief, genuine word, no more than that. He and Leslie were in the elevator at 12:05. The doors closed, and the elevator descended in silence for several floors. That went better than it should have, Leslie said. It went the way the documentation said it would, Damien said. Documentation doesn't always do that. No, he agreed. It doesn't. The elevator reached the lobby. Through the glass front of the building, the city was doing what the city did on a Monday midday in October, moving, indifferent, full of people carrying things nobody could see. Damien stood for a moment before pushing through the door, not because he needed to pause, but because some moments have a shape to them that you recognize even while you're inside them, and this was one of those. And he was old enough now to know that the thing to do when you recognize a shape like that is to let yourself be briefly inside it before you walk back out into everything that comes after. He pushed through the door and walked out into the October air. His phone was already ringing. He didn't answer it yet. He walked half a block first, just walked, feeling the cold air and the ordinary weight of a city around him, and then he stopped at the corner and picked up the call. It was Vera. "How did it go?" she said. 5-1 with an abstention, he said. "Restructuring officer. Asset freeze pending forensic review." A pause. Then, "Okay." Her voice had a quality he didn't hear in it often, something below the professional surface. "Okay. Good. Get me the list of restructuring candidates. I need to have names to Webb by Friday." "Already started," she said. He believed her. He put the phone in his pocket and stood at the corner for another moment, looking at the intersection, the light changing, people moving through it, everything continuing the way. Everything continued. Then he turned and walked back to where he'd parked the car, because Maya got out of school at 3:15 and he'd told Mrs. Okafor he'd handle pickup himself today, and that was something he intended to keep. The names Damien sent to Marcus Webb on Friday were 3. He'd spent 2 evenings with Vera going through the candidates. Not a long list, because the pool of people with the right combination of restructuring experience, independence from all existing parties, and the specific temperament required to walk into a damaged institution and earn the trust of people who had every reason to distrust was never a long list. It was the kind of role that required someone who could be simultaneously firm enough to enforce and patient enough to rebuild. And those two qualities didn't always live comfortably in the same person. The name at the top was Eleanor Marsh. She was 58, had spent 20 years in corporate restructuring, had handled 3 major hotel and hospitality bankruptcies, and had a reputation in the industry for 2 things. Her documentation was always airtight, and she had never in her career laid off a frontline employee before exhausting every alternative at the executive level first. That second thing was not common. It was the thing Damien had looked for. Webb called Saturday morning to confirm. "The board approved Marsh," he said. "She's been contacted. She's reviewing the engagement terms. She'll have questions about the Hartwell documentation. She already does. She's thorough. That's why she's right for it." A pause. "Damien." Webb's voice had a different quality than it usually carried. Less transactional, more considered. "I want you to know that the vote on Monday was not easy for everyone in that room. I'm not telling you that so you'll be grateful. I'm telling you because the people who voted yes are going to need to believe the outcome justifies what they did. That puts something on you as well." "I know," Damien said. "Good." A brief pause. "Marsh will be in contact with you and your counsel early next week." The call ended. Damien was standing in his kitchen again. The same kitchen, the same table, with the unrepaired scratch across the corner, the same October light coming in through the same window. The world had not rearranged itself around the resolution of his situation. The coffee maker still made a particular gurgling sound at the end of its cycle that he'd been meaning to look into for 2 months. The neighbor's dog was barking at something down the street. Things had changed enormously, and nothing looked different. He found that unexpectedly, he was all right with that. Eleanor Marsh moved fast. She was in the Ashford Meridian offices by Wednesday of the following week, and within 48 hours she had issued a comprehensive document hold on all financial records going back 5 years and placed a formal freeze on asset dispositions pending the forensic review. The forensic accounting firm she brought in, a Chicago-based outfit called Rendell and Associates that specialized in exactly this kind of work, had a team of 6 in the Ashford Meridian offices by Friday. The Hartwell documents were their first focus. The forensic analysis took 11 days. Damien wasn't privy to it in real time. Marsh ran a clean process, and clean meant that Damien, as the principal creditor, received information through the appropriate formal channels rather than informally. He didn't push for more than that. He understood that the integrity of the process mattered as much as the result, because a result that couldn't withstand scrutiny was no result at all. The preliminary findings came through Leslie on a Thursday afternoon in early November. She called him while he was at the school pickup line, which was becoming a more consistent part of his schedule now that the most acute pressure of the preceding weeks had lifted somewhat. The forensic team's preliminary findings confirmed the original transfer dates, Leslie said, October and November 2021. The revised documentation Strickland presented in the 2022 meeting was produced in February of 2023. The metadata is definitive on that point. Damien watched through the windshield as children came through the school's front doors in the disorganized, high-energy wave of 3:15. February 2003, he said. That's 14 months after the actual transfers. 14 months after, and 8 months after Chu raised the alarm internally. Leslie's voice was careful and precise in the way it always was when she was delivering something significant. Which means the revised documentation was created specifically in response to Chu's memo. It wasn't a pre-existing record that had been misfiled. It was constructed after the fact to recharacterize transfers that had already violated the covenant restrictions. That's not restructuring, Damien said. That's falsification. That's what the forensic report is going to say in more technical language. A pause. Marsh is going to refer the findings to the SEC. That's not a decision she's made yet, but it's the direction she's moving, and you should be prepared for the process to become significantly more public once that referral happens. Maya appeared through the school doors, backpack on, scanning the pickup line with the systematic efficiency of a child who had done this many times. She spotted the car, changed direction, came toward it. "All right," Damien said, keep me informed." He put the phone down as Maya opened the back door and got in with the particular landing sound of a child who treats car entry as a controlled collapse. "You're here again," she said. "I'm here again. 3 times this week." She was pulling her seatbelt across. "That's a record." "Is it?" "Since September, yeah." She said it without accusation, just as data. She had a scientist's relationship with information. She collected it, she reported it, she didn't necessarily attach judgment to it, unless the judgment was warranted. "Is your work thing done?" "Most of it." "Is the hard part done?" He pulled out of the pickup line and thought about how to answer that honestly to a 9-year-old. "The hardest part is done," he said. "There's still work, but the hardest part is done." She seemed to accept this. She looked out the window. "Can we get pancakes?" "It's 4 in the afternoon. Pancakes are for any time." He drove 3 blocks to a diner. Not Patty's, a different one that Maya had chosen on a previous occasion based on the criterion that it had a picture of a stack of pancakes in the window, which she considered a credible form of advertising. They sat in a booth, and she ordered pancakes and he ordered coffee, and they sat across from each other in the ordinary way of 2 people who were used to each other's company, and she told him about a fight 2 kids in her class had had over who discovered the deep ocean first, which apparently had escalated to a level that required teacher intervention, and he listened and asked questions and thought about none of the things he'd been thinking about for the past 3 weeks. For approximately an hour, the weight of everything was just weight, the way all weight eventually becomes ordinary if you carry it long enough. The SEC referral came 6 weeks later, in December. By that point, Eleanor Marsh had been formally appointed as Chief Restructuring Officer with the full authority granted by the board's October vote, and Ashford Meridian had entered into a consensual restructuring agreement with its creditors, including Meridian Capital Recovery Group, that provided a framework for addressing the debt position over a 30-month period without forcing the company into formal insolvency proceedings. Patrick Strickland, the general counsel who had presented the revised Hartwell documentation in 2022, resigned 2 days before the SEC referral became public. His resignation letter cited personal reasons. Nobody with knowledge of the situation believed this, but nobody was required to. Celeste Ashford's formal separation from the company was not a firing. The board had been careful about the legal framing, partly for procedural reasons, and partly because several members had long enough institutional memory to know that the difference between resigned and removed mattered in ways that courts would eventually have opinions about. The public announcement said she was stepping back from day-to-day leadership to focus on strategic matters, which was the corporate language equivalent of a polite fiction that everyone understood to be a polite fiction. She retained her equity position and her seat on a newly restructured board, which was a concession that Damien had not opposed. He'd been asked, through intermediaries, whether he intended to push for her complete removal, and his answer had been no. Not because he had warm feelings about the outcome for Celeste Ashford personally, but because the equity she held was her own money to lose or recover, and because a protracted personal fight over her board seat was the kind of thing that consumed energy and attention that the company needed pointed elsewhere. He said this to Vera one morning in November, when she raised it. Vera looked at him the way she occasionally looked at him when she was trying to assess whether he meant what he said, or whether he was constructing a position he thought sounded better than the underlying one. "You're not bothered by her keeping the seat," she said. "I didn't say I'm not bothered by it. I said it's not worth the fight." "There's a difference." "Yes." She seemed to accept that. "She's going to be in the room during restructuring discussions." "She's going to be in the room with Eleanor Marsh running the room," Damien said. "That's a different proposition than Celeste being in the room she's been running for 20 years. Marsh was, in practice, exactly what her reputation suggested. She was efficient in a way that didn't require her to be cold. She had the ability to deliver difficult decisions directly without making them feel punitive, which was a rare skill and one Damien had observed in very few people over his career. When she began restructuring the executive compensation structure in November, reducing the top tier of executive pay by 32% and eliminating a series of benefits arrangements that she described, in her characteristically understated way, as not aligned with the company's current financial position. She did it in a single meeting with the affected parties, explained the reasoning in full, and then declined to discuss it further. When she did the same thing with the catering staff contracts that had been restructured 2 years prior in ways that reduced their health coverage, reversing those reductions and absorbing the costs back into the operating budget. She did it without announcement, without a press release. The people whose coverage was restored received letters. Most of them, Damien was told, didn't initially understand what had changed until they tried to use benefits they'd been quietly adjusting their lives around not having. He heard this from Arthur, who'd heard it from someone at the company. He sat with it for a moment. There was something in it that felt important. The unremarked correction of a quiet harm, the restoration of something that had been taken without drama, because it could be taken without drama, restored now the same way, without spectacle, because it was right. The 2017 report was entered into the formal record of the restructuring proceedings in January, along with a summary assessment from Rendell and Associates that confirmed its analytical conclusions. There was no press conference about it. There was no moment where someone stood at a podium and formally acknowledged that Damien Cross had been right. It appeared in a document filing. It became part of the documented history of the company's financial governance. That was enough. He hadn't known, until it happened, whether it was going to be enough. He'd thought about this moment many times over 7 years. What it would feel like to have the record corrected, whether the correction would feel like the thing he'd been working toward, or whether it would feel like something smaller than he'd imagined it. The way things you work toward for a long time sometimes feel smaller when you finally reach them. He didn't know which it was going to be until it was in front of him. It felt real, not large and not small, just accurate, like a number that had been entered wrong in a ledger for 7 years finally corrected, not celebrated, just fixed, so the books could balance going forward. He called Arthur the day the filing was confirmed and said, "The report's in the record." Arthur said, "How do you feel?" Damien thought about it for a moment, which Arthur allowed. "Tired," Damien said, "and okay." "That sounds about right," Arthur said. In February, 4 months into the restructuring, Eleanor Marsh requested a formal meeting with Damien at her offices. Not Ashford Meridian's offices, her own, in a building across town, an environment that was neutral in every sense of the word. She was a compact, gray-haired woman who shook his hand with the matter-of-fact energy of someone who didn't attach ceremony to things that didn't require it. Her office was organized and spare, the desk occupied by a single monitor and several precisely stacked files. She offered coffee. He accepted. She sat across from him and looked at him with the direct, assessing quality of someone who had decided to have one conversation and was going to have it. "I want to talk to you about the restructuring officer role going forward," she said. "All right." The engagement I agreed to in October was for the acute phase, stabilizing the finances, addressing the covenant violations, overseeing the forensic process. That phase is substantially complete. She folded her hands on the desk. What the company needs now is different. It needs someone who can rebuild, not just the balance sheet, the culture, the governance, the internal trust structures that were damaged over a period of years. She looked at him steadily. "The board has asked me to recommend someone for an expanded CEO role, not a caretaker, someone permanent or near permanent who can take the company through the next 3 to 5 years. Damien held her gaze. "They're asking about me." "They're asking me about you," she said. "There's a distinction. They're asking whether I think it's advisable, given your position as principal creditor and the history of your involvement, for you to move into a leadership role." "What do you think?" She was quiet for a moment, which he respected. She wasn't performing consideration. She was actually considering. "I think your instincts about what the company needed were correct," she said. "I think the way you built your position was patient and legally sound and ultimately served the company's interests as well as your own. I think the employees I've spoken with who know your involvement view you more positively than you might expect." A pause. "I also think that a principal creditor becoming CEO creates a governance complication that some shareholders and some regulators are going to find uncomfortable, and that managing that discomfort would consume a portion of your energy that the company would be better served by directing elsewhere." "You're recommending against it," Damien said. "I'm recommending that you recommend against it," she said. "There's a distinction there too." He looked at the window. The February light was flat and gray in the way February light was. No particular ambition to it. I have a candidate, he said. Marsh waited. Her name is Vera Osei. She's been with my fund for 3 years. Before that, she was at a mid-sized hospitality investment firm for 4 years. She has a structural understanding of hospitality finance that most people in her age range don't, and she has the specific quality of being someone that people adjust their behavior toward when she's in the room, not because she demands it, but because she earns it. He paused. She's 34, which is going to make some people on the board uncomfortable. I'll talk to the board about age, Marsh said. That's not a substantive objection. There's also the question of whether she'd take it, Damien said. She hasn't been asked. Would she? Damien thought about Vera standing in his office doorway the morning after the gala, holding a printout, telling him what the coverage said. He thought about her at the whiteboard, saying the hardest part about a long game is knowing when the game changes. He thought about the evening she'd sat across from him at the conference table, going through the Hartwell documentation for the 3rd time, and said without looking up, "This is going to matter to the people who work there. I need you to know I'm doing this because of that, not just because of the numbers." She'd take it, he said, but she'd need to negotiate the terms carefully, and she'd want real authority, not the kind that gets quietly reduced by board committees over the first 18 months. I can help with that, Marsh said. Then I'd like to recommend her formally. Marsh wrote something down. I'll arrange a meeting. He told Vera that evening. He debated whether to give her more notice, more time to think about it before it became real, and then he decided that Vera wasn't the kind of person who needed more time to think. She needed accurate information as early as possible because she thought better with the full picture than with the partial one. He called her at 6:30. She was still at the office, which was standard. Eleanor Marsh is going to call you, he said, about a conversation with the Ashford Meridian board. A pause. About what? The CEO role. Longer pause. Damien, you're the right person. I'm not saying that because you work for me or because I want to hand this off. I'm saying it because of what I've watched you do for 3 years, and because I think you know it too. It's a company that just went through a governance crisis, she said. The employees are uncertain. The board is fragmented. The external perception is, all of those things are true, he said. They're also all things you're good at. Maybe better than anyone I know. Silence on the line. Not the silence of someone who needed persuading. The silence of someone who was already persuading herself and needed a moment to finish. What does it do to the fund if I take it? She said. The fund survives. I'll backfill. It's going to be harder for a while. He paused. That's not a reason. No, she said. It's not. Another silence. Tell Marsh I'll call her tomorrow, Vera said. The board formally approved Vera Osei as CEO of Ashford Meridian at a meeting in late March. She was 34 years old. She was the youngest person to hold the role in the company's history, a fact the financial press noted with the combination of impressed and slightly skeptical attention they gave to any appointment that didn't fit the standard template. Her first act as CEO was a meeting with the department heads of every Ashford Meridian property. Not a conference call, not a video meeting. Physical meetings, property by property, over 3 weeks. She flew to Chicago and Napa and the coastal property in Carolina that had been quietly operating under a shadow of ownership uncertainty for 2 years. She sat in staff rooms with housekeeping supervisors and maintenance leads and food and beverage managers, and she asked them what the company had gotten wrong and what it needed to do differently, and she wrote things down, and she didn't promise anything she didn't intend to deliver. Damien heard about the meetings from multiple directions. A maintenance supervisor at the Chicago property was quoted in a trade publication saying he'd never in 20 years had a member of senior leadership ask him what the company needed to do better, without then spending the rest of the conversation explaining why his answer was wrong. The quote was small, buried in the middle of a longer piece, the kind of thing most people skimmed past. Damien read it twice. The Hartwell properties, the 3 that had been transferred into family-controlled entities, were the subject of a separate legal process that ran parallel to the restructuring. The forensic findings formed the basis of an SEC investigation that Damien was not centrally involved in, having provided the relevant documentation through proper channels and then stepped back. The process was going to take time. These things always did, and its outcome was not his to determine. He'd been asked by a journalist in March whether he expected Celeste Ashford to face legal consequences. That's for the relevant authorities to determine, he said. I'm not a prosecutor. But you think she did something wrong? I think the documentation shows what it shows, Damien said. I've said everything I have to say about that inside the appropriate processes. I don't have more to add. The journalist pushed. There are people who see what you've done as a personal vendetta. Damien looked at the journalist, a younger man who had the slightly combative energy of someone trying to provoke a reaction that would make better copy. 7 years ago, Damien said, I wrote a report that was accurate. The company buried the report and ended my contract. I rebuilt my career, built a fund, and purchased a debt position in a company whose publicly available financials I believed, and which evidence confirmed were being deliberately misrepresented to its creditors. The legal position was sound. The financial analysis was sound. The company is now in a restructuring that has preserved 4,000 jobs and is restoring assets that were improperly transferred. He paused. If someone wants to call that a vendetta, I can't stop them, but I'd ask them to tell me which part was wrong. The journalist didn't have an answer for that. They moved on to a different question. In April, Meridian Capital Recovery Group formally converted a portion of its Ashford Meridian debt position to equity, a standard mechanism in restructurings of this kind, negotiated between the parties and approved by the board. The conversion reduced the debt burden on the company and gave the fund a minority equity stake in what was now, under Vera's early guidance, showing early signs of operational stabilization. It was not a triumphant outcome in the cinematic sense. The company's stock was still depressed. 2 of the European properties remained difficult. One of the North American properties was going to require significant capital investment that hadn't been adequately deferred maintenance addressed under prior leadership. These were real problems, and they were going to be hard, and Vera was going to have to deal with them without the kind of clear, specific enemy that Damien had spent 7 years focused on. That was in some ways the harder kind of work. The work after the crisis. The ordinary, grinding, uncinematic work of building something functional out of something that had been allowed to decay. He talked to Vera on a Friday in late April, a few weeks after she'd completed her property tour. It was a brief call. She was busy in the way that people who have just started a major new role are busy, which is to say, comprehensively. How are you doing? He asked. Ask me in a year, she said. Are you okay right now? A pause. Yeah, she said. Yeah, I am. It's a lot. But it's the right a lot, if that makes sense. It does, he said. It was late May when Damien went back to the Harrington Grand. Not for a gala. There was no event. He went on a Tuesday evening after work, in a plain jacket and no particular reason anyone looking at him would have identified as significant. I went because he'd been thinking about it for a few weeks, and because he understood himself well enough to know that the thing he needed wasn't closure, exactly. That word had always seemed to him to describe something cleaner and more final than what actually happened when long things ended. What he needed was just to go back and stand in the room and let it be an ordinary room. The Harrington Grand was as it always was. High ceilings, marble floors. The same chandelier from the Venetian glassblower, doing its job with the impassive brilliance of an object that didn't know or care what human events had occurred beneath it. He sat at the bar, not in the ballroom, just at the bar off the lobby, which was where civilians sat when they weren't attending events. He ordered a bourbon he didn't particularly need and sat with it and looked at the room. A waiter came by to clear the neighboring table and Damien watched him work. The efficient, automatic movements of someone who had done this 10,000 times. The small professional calibrations. Young guy, maybe 26, face that suggested he had other things going on in his life that this job was currently funding. He worked without looking up, without performing anything for the room, just doing the work. Damien thought about the version of himself that had been in this room 6 months ago. He thought about standing in the service corridor after Sandra had given him the quiet version of the firing, and about driving home in the 10-year-old Honda and eating the gas station sandwich and listening to the phone ring. I thought about those years, the ones after Calloway and Reed, and before any of this. The years that hadn't had a narrative shape while he was inside them, that had just felt like a man trying to hold things together, while something in him was still working on a problem he didn't always let himself look at directly. He had not enjoyed most of those years. He had gotten through them. He had raised a daughter who currently had 17 detailed drawings of anglerfish and could explain the bioluminescent properties of deep-sea creatures with a rigor that would embarrass most adults. He had built something that worked. He had held on to a belief. Not in justice in any abstract sense, not in the idea that things eventually balanced, because they often didn't, but in the specific stubborn conviction that accurate work, done with patience and integrity, was not wasted even when it was punished. He hadn't known that was true when he believed it. He just believed it because the alternative was to stop believing it, and he couldn't figure out how to do that and still be the person he needed to be for Maya. But it had turned out to be true. Not automatically, not effortlessly, not without cost. Just true. The bourbon sat in front of him. He didn't finish it. He sat for a while in the ordinary noise of the lobby bar, other people's conversations, the soft ambient sound of a hotel being a hotel. And he felt, without trying to name it too precisely, something that was in the vicinity of peace, not the absence of difficulty, not the completion of anything that was really completable, just the specific grounded feeling of a person who has done what he set out to do and is now sitting in a bar on a Tuesday evening with the whole open, unscheduled, unplotted rest of his life in front of him. He left 20 minutes later. He tipped the bartender more than the drink warranted and walked out through the marble lobby and through the brass doors into the May evening, which was warm in the way May evenings occasionally were. Warmth you hadn't quite expected yet, arriving before you were ready for it. He called Maya on the walk to his car. She picked up on the second ring. "Where are you?" she said. She asked this the way people asked who knew you were somewhere you didn't normally go. "I went somewhere for work," he said. "I'm heading home now." Mrs. Okafor made soup. "What kind?" "The kind with the beans." A pause. "It's good." "Save me some," he said. "I already did," she said. "I put it in the container with the blue lid so you'd know it was yours." He reached his car and stood beside it for a moment in the warm May air, phone to his ear, the city doing its unremarkable continuous thing around him. "You put it in the container with the blue lid," he said. "Yeah." She said it simply, without knowing it was anything. Just a fact. Just a small, unremarkable act of someone who had been thinking of him. He stood there a second longer than he needed to. "I'll be home in 20 minutes, he said. He got in the car and drove home through streets that were ordinary and familiar and entirely unremarkable. And the thing he understood, not for the first time but more clearly than he had in a while, was that this was what it actually looked like. Not victory with a capital letter. Not the moment the room goes silent and everything resolves. Just a man driving home in the evening to a bowl of soup that someone had saved for him, to a daughter who had drawn anglerfish all over her notebook, to a life that was harder than he'd once expected it to be, and more his than he had any right to, given everything. He parked on the street in front of the building. He sat for a moment with the engine off. He had spent 7 years learning something that most people spend their whole lives arguing about. That character doesn't guarantee anything. That patience doesn't guarantee anything. That doing the right work in the right way doesn't protect you from the people who would rather bury it. But that those things, character, patience, honest work, are the only foundation that doesn't eventually give way underneath you. Not because the world rewards them, just because they're yours. And the things that are genuinely yours are the only things that stay with you when everything else gets taken away. He got out of the car, walked up the front steps, and went inside. The soup was exactly what it was supposed to be. Nothing spectacular, beans and broth and something green that Maya had picked around the edges of her bowl, but left mostly intact because she was 9 and 9-year-olds maintained certain principles about vegetables. Mrs. Okafor had left it on the stove with the burner on the lowest setting, which was the kind of thing you only knew to do if you'd been feeding people for a long time. Damien ate it standing at the counter because the table had Maya's homework spread across it, and he didn't feel like moving any of it. She was sitting in the living room now, nominally watching a nature documentary but mostly drawing in her notebook, the television providing background narration about something in the Arctic that she'd periodically look up at and then return to her drawing with the attitude of someone fact-checking a source. He ate the soup and listened to her exist in the other room and thought about very little. That was new, actually, the ability to think about very little. For 7 years, there had always been something running underneath everything else. Not always loud, not always intrusive, but present. A low-frequency hum of unfinished business that colored the ordinary moments even when he wasn't consciously attending to it. He hadn't always noticed it when it was there. He noticed it now in its absence, the way you notice a sound has stopped only after the quiet arrives. He washed the bowl when he finished. He dried it and put it back in the cabinet. Small things. Maya appeared in the kitchen doorway. "The anglerfish has a thing on its head," she said, holding up her notebook to show him a drawing that was genuinely more detailed than anything he could have produced at twice her age. "It's called an esca. It makes light so prey comes toward it in the dark." "That sounds dangerous," he said. "For the prey." "That's the point." She looked at the drawing with professional satisfaction. "They think it's something good, and it's actually something that's going to eat them." He looked at his daughter. "That's a little dark for a Tuesday night." "Nature is dark," she said, with complete serenity. She went back to her drawing. He stood in the kitchen for another moment, smiling at nothing in particular, and then he went and sat in the chair across from her and picked up a book he'd been trying to finish for 3 months, and actually read 4 pages of it before his phone buzzed once on the side table. A text from Vera. "First week done, still standing." He typed back, "That's the job." Her response came after a minute. "Harder than the fund." He considered that. Typed, "Different hard." A pause. Then, "Yeah, different hard." And then, after another moment, "Thank you for the recommendation. I know what it cost." He looked at that last sentence for a while. It wasn't wrong. There had been a cost in the practical sense. Vera was the best analyst he'd worked with, and rebuilding that capacity in the fund was going to take time and wouldn't be seamless. He'd known that when he recommended her. He'd done it anyway because the right answer to a question about what a person should do is supposed to be the right answer, not the convenient one. He typed back, "You'd have done the same." The response was immediate this time. "I would have." He put the phone down and went back to his book. The months that followed had the texture of ordinary life reassembling itself after a long disruption. Not all at once, but gradually, the way a room looks different after you've moved the furniture back and lived in it for a while and forgotten where everything used to be. Damien hired 2 new analysts for the fund, a process that took longer than he'd budgeted for because finding people with the right combination of technical skill and judgment was always slower than the job posting suggested it would be. The fund's other positions needed attention that had been somewhat divided during the acute months of the Ashford Meridian situation, and he gave them that attention, which was steadying in its own way, the return to the ordinary discipline of the work. He went to Maya's school presentation in June, the one where the 3rd and 4th graders presented their independent research projects. Maya presented on deep-sea bioluminescence and included, at the end, a hand-drawn diagram of an anglerfish with every anatomical part labeled in handwriting that was impressively small and precise for a 9-year-old. The other parents applauded politely. Mrs. Delaney, the teacher, caught Damien's eye across the room with an expression that communicated something in the range of, "She is a very specific child," which Damien received as the compliment he believed it was intended to be. He took her out for pancakes after. "You did well," he said. "I know," she said, pouring syrup with the focused deliberateness of someone who had views about syrup distribution. "I practiced 4 times." "I didn't know you practiced." "You were working." She said it without resentment, just as information. "I practiced with Mrs. Okafor. She said I talked too fast in the beginning." "Did you slow down?" "Some." She cut her pancakes. She said it was better. He looked at his daughter across the diner table, at the anglerfish notebook sitting beside her plate, at the syrup she'd distributed with complete personal conviction, at the face that was starting to show the earliest traces of the person she was becoming. He thought about what she was going to be in 10 years, in 20. He didn't know, obviously. Nobody knew that, but he had a feeling, the particular unverifiable parental feeling, that she was going to be someone who moved through the world with both curiosity and backbone, who would ask the uncomfortable question in the room and not apologize for having asked it. He hoped he'd have some small part in that. He hoped the years she'd watched him navigate something long and difficult and occasionally discouraging had shown her something worth knowing, that you could be knocked down to something that didn't look like much and still be building something, still be working towards something that had integrity, and that the people who dismissed you based on what they could see at that moment were working with incomplete information. He didn't say any of this to her. She was 9, eating pancakes, and the moment didn't call for a speech. The moment called for someone to eat breakfast with her on a Saturday morning, which was the whole of what he was trying to do. He ate his eggs. She ate her pancakes. Outside the diner window, the June morning was doing what June mornings do, suggesting, without commitment, that the world was possibly better than your average Tuesday. One small thing happened in July that he didn't expect, and that he thought about for longer than it probably warranted. He received a letter, physical mail, which almost nobody used for anything meaningful anymore, which was part of why it caught his attention. The return address was a law firm he didn't recognize. Inside was a single page, formal in its language but clearly written by someone who had chosen each word rather than letting a template choose them. It was from Celeste Ashford. Not an apology, exactly. He hadn't expected an apology. It didn't begin with "I'm sorry," and it didn't use the word "wrong" in relation to any specific action. What it said, in language that had clearly been reviewed by attorneys before it was sent, was that she had reviewed the 2017 report in its complete form and that she believed, her word, that its conclusions had been substantively accurate and that the manner in which her company had responded to it at the time had not served the company or its stakeholders. It was a limited acknowledgement, a carefully bounded one. It did not expose her legally, said nothing about the asset transfers, committed to nothing. It was the kind of letter that existed in the narrow space between saying nothing and saying everything, and he understood that a lawyer had helped architect that space deliberately. But she had written it. She had sent it. He sat at his kitchen table and read it twice. He didn't feel vindicated. Vindication had come through the documented record, through the restructuring process, through the things that were now formally on the record, whether anyone wanted them there or not. What he felt was something smaller and harder to name. The recognition that a person who had spent 20 years moving through the world with absolute authority over every room she entered had sat down and written this letter, and that whatever the legal precision of its language, the act of writing it had required something from her. He didn't respond. There was nothing to respond to that would add anything. He folded the letter and put it in the back of a file folder and went back to his evening. The fund closed a strong quarter in September. Vera's first full quarter as CEO showed operating metrics that were cautious but positive, the kind of numbers that didn't inspire celebration, but inspired the more durable emotion of cautious belief that the direction was right. The board expressed confidence in formal language that Damien had learned, over years of reading board communications, to decode with some accuracy. What it actually said, between the formal lines, was, "We think we made the right call." He believed they had. On a Friday evening in October, almost exactly 1 year after the gala at the Harrington Grand, Damien Cross sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him and nothing urgent on the agenda for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember. Maya was at a sleepover. The apartment was quiet in the full, clean way apartments are quiet, when there is nobody else in them and nothing requiring attention. He sat for a while and let the quiet be quiet. He thought about the word patience, how people used it as though it were a passive thing, a form of waiting, when in his experience it was the most demanding of the active virtues. Patience required you to keep working on something without the assurance that the work would resolve. It required you to hold on to a belief in accuracy and integrity without the guarantee that accuracy and integrity would be rewarded. It required you to do the right work the right way on a Tuesday, when nobody was watching and nothing was guaranteed, and there was a daughter at home who needed someone to make her eggs in the morning and drive her to school and show up at the 3:15 pickup line. It wasn't heroic. It was just what you did, day after day, for as long as it took. He picked up his coffee, found it cold, and went to warm it up. The kitchen was the same kitchen. The scratch on the table was still there. He still hadn't sanded it. The coffee maker still made its particular end-of-cycle sound. Everything was the same and everything was different, and he was, in the way that mattered, exactly where he was supposed to be. He stood at the window with his coffee and looked out at the neighborhood settling into its Friday night, lights coming on in windows, someone's music faint from a floor above, the ordinary evidence of ordinary lives being lived without drama or resolution or conclusion, just continuing the way lives do, past the end of every story you think you're in. He thought, this is enough. He meant it without qualification. It was enough.